Welcome to part 2 of this video series of J. Warner Wallace telling us if the Gospels were reliable and if they were eyewitness testimony. Or is he? I doubt it because we haven't gotten there yet and we're still only 10 minutes into this video, but maybe he'll get there. I doubt it. But this is part 2. If you haven't checked out part 1, be sure to do that first, or this part might not make a whole lot of sense, but we're going to jump into it.
Or I became a Christian using forensic statement analysis because I was so involved in it. But I was not assigned as a cold case detective because most detectives in America who are investigating cold cases, you would say, is that a cold case detective? Yes. Is he officially assigned as a cold case detective? No. He's either a homicide detective, a robbery homicide detective, maybe a forgery. He's just working a case. So that's how I first got started in working cold cases, was that Terry Lynn Hollis case.
Okay, interesting. That's helpful. So you start at that point. You've obviously been doing it
That is in no way helpful.
for years and years now.
Mhm.
How do you determine, say, that document, for example, that you have? Somebody wrote this document at the time you started this, it had been decade or decades before. How do you root if it's reliable and if it's eyewitness testimony? What kind of things do you look for while you're signing that? And of course, everybody knows we're going to shift and go to the gospel soon, but I want to get in the mind of how you think as a detective.
Are we though?
Looking at a document like that.
So here's a good example of this. This guy's name, I think, was Ronald Kapp, and it's in the news, so it's not like I'm giving away an investigative secret. And he confessed to the entire thing and said he was there when it occurred. He did it, so he's claiming to be there. So he not only saw it as he was doing it, he's claiming to be there. Okay, it's a long confession, about 1,000 pages.
What do you mean he not only saw it as he was doing it, but is also claiming to be there? If you saw it as you were doing it, you were there. That's not two separate things. Okay, let's keep going.
So the first claim is,
wait, 1,000 pages, not just 1,000 words?
A 1,000-page transcript, yeah, because it's double spaced, and the investigator asks a question, then Ronald responds, blah blah blah.
Got it.
So this is big. He has 2 notebooks. It was 2 red notebooks. So I'm looking at this case and I'm thinking, oh, so why would I consider this even to begin with? Well, because he's making a claim. He's making the claim internally in the document that he was there. So I got to test it. Now, is he an eyewitness? Is it reliable? How would I know? Well, does the stuff he's telling me match up with the evidence we have? We have some evidence that kind of shows us the kind of murder this was. And he's going to have to describe, we're not gonna, the sad thing about it was that the initial investigators gave him too much information in advance that he just kind of leveraged to make up a story. What you want to do, honestly, is to give him no information. You tell me what happened, then I'll see if what you're saying matches the evidence I have in hand. And once we did it that way, it didn't match. And we did solve it ultimately with DNA years later, and it wasn't him. So he was lying the whole time. So what am I looking for? Is there some claim? And also, like if I said I did this and I took her body to the hills in Oxnard, but there is no Oxnard, or he described.
So wait, hold on. Did he just say that they ultimately solved it with DNA evidence? In part 1 of this series, he said that DNA evidence is equal to eyewitness testimony. So now we have a scenario where he has eyewitness testimony, but it was actually solved with DNA evidence. Because they, of course, are not equal. J. Warner Wallace is a fool when he says that DNA evidence and eyewitness testimony and fingerprints are equal in they're equal evidence. It's simply not the case. But let's keep going.
Oxnard, and he describes it inaccurately because he's from the East Coast and doesn't even know what Oxnard looks like. Well, then I'm starting to doubt. But if he accurately describes this, I can at least say, well, he's familiar with the area. So I'm trying to sort out the lie from the truth, because every lie contains truth. That's what a good lie is. Have you ever played that game, Spot the Lie game, where I'm going to tell you, well, what do I do?
Every lie does not contain truth. I don't even know what that means.
I tell you a true story, but I change one detail. It's really hard to catch it because it kind of sounds like a true story. I've just changed the detail. I could tell you how my dog ran away, give you every detail that makes sense, but actually it was my cat that ran away. So it is a lie, but it's harder to catch because all those other details line up. Lots of what we're doing in these kinds of investigations.
Oh my God.
That is not a game I would want to play with you. That would not be fair.
Because he's just so damn good, right, Sean McDowell? No.
Probably fool me because I mean we are. Look, I'm not a Sherlock Holmes, right? Don't you love watching that show where Sherlock spots some little weird thing over here and he connects all these dots back to the killer? That doesn't really happen. But we do have some processes in place. That's why we test eyewitnesses under those 4 criteria that I always talk about, because there's a test in place. Number 1, does it appear to be an eyewitness account in the sense that it is not just giving you a bunch of facts? For example, compare the Gospel of Thomas with the Gospel of Matthew. I don't think anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I covered this in the last video. Let's compare the Gospels and see how they're absolutely wildly different. At some points, incompatibly different. Why is he bringing this up? Because the Gospels, they're not the same. So I'm curious how he's gonna mesh this together.
One looks at the Gospel of Thomas, you might say, well, maybe somebody was there to hear these statements, but it doesn't even appear to be an eyewitness account because it does not describe in any kind of chronology any series of events. It's just a set of proverbial statements of Jesus. That could be true or it could be false. How would you test them? He's not saying he entered Capernaum and he went into the house of Peter's mother. He's not making claims about a sequence of events that is typical of eyewitness testimony. And also, if you compare like the Gospels to like Peter Pan, the author of Peter Pan never
Sure.
claims that it's history. He
Mhm.
never claims that he's viewing this as an eyewitness.
To be fair, the Gospels don't either, right? Show me where in the Gospels that this is a truth claim, that they're presenting this as history. Now I get it that by and large it's accepted that it was, but if you just go by what the text says, it kind of doesn't say that it actually happened.
The Gospel authors are quite different. Luke says, I didn't see this stuff. I was with Paul in the book of Acts, but I talked to the people who were the eyewitnesses. Oh, you mean there were eyewitnesses? Apparently. Well, if there were eyewitnesses according to Luke, what are they witnessing? There you go. Now we're looking at claims. The only question is their testimony reliable?
That's not true. That's far from the truth. That is not the only question, is their testimony reliable? You know, did these people actually exist? Who are the eyewitnesses? Is their testimony true? Did the testimony happen at all? There's so many more questions than whether or not it was reliable. You can't even establish that there were eyewitnesses, let alone that the eyewitnesses that it was reliable. You have to establish that eyewitnesses even existed. Who are they? Can we talk to them? Can we question them? Well, of course not, because that happened so long ago. But whether or not they're reliable is not step one. It is far from step one, Wallace.
Okay, so in a court of law, you would say eyewitness testimony is equal to other kinds of testimony. In
He just explained a specific scenario, his own example, where eyewitness testimony simply was not equal to other kinds of testimony, which by testimony, Sean McDowell, I'm pretty sure he means other kinds of evidence, because what other kind of, you know what I mean? In the last video, they went over how these different type of evidences were equal. You have direct and indirect. Watch the last video. It's fine. But he just described this whole scenario where they clearly were not equal. The eyewitness testimony was entirely unreliable, and it had to be solved with the DNA evidence. Here's another interesting fact that I want to point out. J. Warner Wallace just described a scenario where somebody confessed to a murder that he did not commit, and it had to be solved with DNA evidence. So the next time somebody gives you if you say, well, why do you believe that the Jesus, he was the Son of God, he rose from the dead, whatever, and they give you that, why would you die for a lie thing? Refer them to J. Warner Wallace's video here, because he just described a scenario where somebody, given, maybe if the death penalty was on the table for this guy for committing this murder, why would he die for this lie? Because he certainly was going to. I'm just saying.
Other kinds of evidence. Eyewitness testimony is a form of evidence equal to other forms of evidence.
Good clarification. Thank you. When it comes to the
He just finished the story. It's so frustrating watching J. Warner Wallace talk to anybody, because he just finished a story where he described a scenario where these were not equal. If they were equal, why did they take the DNA evidence over the eyewitness test, the confession? Why would he die for a lie? Wouldn't that be the ultimate evidence if somebody confessed to a crime? Why would they confess to a crime they didn't commit? So many questions.
Say the Gospels and their reliability, would that same thing apply? Like whether they're ultimately eyewitness accounts or not doesn't determine if they're true, or would it help our cause more so if we have reason to believe that they're eyewitnesses?
We're going to let Wallace respond, and then we're going to cut this video. I wanted to keep these videos around 10 minutes, but I talk a lot, so that's difficult. So we're going to let him respond, and then we're cutting it.
Okay, so I think the identity of the eyewitness doesn't matter to me, but the question is this written by an eyewitness does matter to me.
Okay.
Because the easiest thing to do to lie about Jesus is just wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead and then say anything you want, because there's no one, even if it's not written early enough, there's not even, forget about the fact that I can't be an eyewitness if it's written in the 2nd century. The better thing is that I can't be fact checked by an eyewitness if I write it in the 2nd century. So the question is,
who in 2nd century Jerusalem, wherever I forget where they were, who in 2nd century was around fact checking somebody, some nameless person who happened to be crucified and killed and forgotten to history. Jesus wasn't a big thing when he died. He just wasn't. I think that's pretty well established fact. He grew relatively quickly. But nobody was going around fact checking anything back then. But let's keep going.
is it early? That's important to me because it's harder
Okay.
to lie early than it is to lie late. And then could it be tested in some way? It matters as well. So I think in the end, those are the things, those are the highest values I hold. Because by the way, this happens all the time in cold cases. You're 30 years after the case, and they thought they interviewed all 5 people who saw it, but it turns out there was a 6th person who was never comfortable talking about it 30 years ago because he or she says, I was too close to the suspect, and now I don't fear the suspect anymore, so I'm willing to talk today. Well, okay, were you really there? How do I got to test this thing, because you can make any kind of claim. I don't know if you were really there. I got to start to investigate those issues. Were you really there?
But we haven't gotten into your case.
Okay, so we're going to cut this video here. I'm going to close with this. J. Warner Wallace's level of eyewitness testimony that he's willing to accept is silly. But even if you took him, let's just say that his I can't think of the right word that I'm trying to think of here. Let's just say that his standards of evidence for eyewitness testimony, let's just say that they were fine, which they aren't. That's of course crazy. What if they were there? Whatever. Now imagine that somebody met his standards of evidence. They were there, and what was the other one?
Were you really there? How do I got to test this?
Were you there?
Because you can make any kind of claim. I don't know if you were really there. I got to start to investigate those issues. Were you really there? I don't think we said people who saw it, but it turns out there was a 6th person who was never comfortable talking about it 30 years ago because he or she says, I was too close to the suspect,
Oh boy.
and now I don't fear the suspect anymore, so I'm willing to talk today. Well, okay, were you really there? How do I got to test this thing, because you can make any kind of claim. I don't know if you were really there. I got to start to investigate those issues. Were you really there?
All right, well, whatever he says, were you there? And the other thing that he said, I forget already, because it's hard to follow J. Warner Wallace. He changes his mind very often. But if somebody met his standards of evidence for eyewitness testimony, but they also said there was a ghost involved, would J. Warner Wallace still accept this person's eyewitness testimony? If they met both of his standards, the things that were most important to him, whatever he said, but they also said there was a ghost involved, what would his next step be? I don't know, because that's similar to what's going on in the Gospels. Here's were they really there? Fine, yes, they were really there. Is it reliable? I don't want to go all the way back and find out what his other thing was. I really don't care. It's not important. But they meet both of his standards, but they also say, oh, and by the way, we saw a dead body resurrect from the dead. Where do you go from? What do you do with that based off of his standards of eyewitness testimony? Maybe he'll explain it, but we're going to cut this one here, and we will continue with part 3.